Hello, I'm Mark Norman, folklore researcher and author, and welcome back to another episode of the Folklore Podcast. In today's episode, I'm going to be turning my attention to Scottish folklore. Now, we've looked at folklore from Scotland before on the podcast, but it's always been part of broader themed episodes. I haven't yet had a chance to focus purely on this topic on its own, and today we redress that balance. And I say we because I am not alone. Joining me as my special guest for this episode is Scottish-based author Lyndsey Croal. Lyndsey is a science fiction and speculative fiction author predominantly. She's been published in 80-plus magazines and anthologies, and her work has been shortlisted as a finalist work for the Shirley Jackson Award, the British Fantasy Society Awards, and a number of others. Her most recent book, Dark Crescent, was published recently by Luna Press Publishing, and it has a very firm folklore focus to a number of its stories. So that's our springboard to unpick this world of Scottish folklore today. In this interview, you'll hear me chatting to Lyndsey about the book and about the folkloric themes behind the stories and the lore and legend of her home country of Scotland. I hope you enjoy this interview. Lyndsey, welcome to the Folklore Podcast. First time guest, but we've chatted to each other for a little bit on the world of folklore social media before this. It's lovely to have you here.
Yeah, lovely to be here, and thanks for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. So we are going to talk about Scottish folklore today. I haven't covered Scottish folklore yet in great detail. It's come up in other episodes and in kind of little bits and things like that. But I'm trying to put a bit of a focus on different regions, different countries, different counties, depending on how you look at it, during the course of this year, one way or another. So now is our chance to go into a little bit more detail. But before we do that, tell everybody a little bit about yourself. Who is Lyndsey Croal?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone who's listening. My name is Lyndsey Croal. I'm a Scottish author of sci-fi, fantasy, horror, anything kind of weird with a speculative or strange bent. And the reason I'm here, a lot of my work is inspired by Scottish folklore. I like to kind of look at strange stories in Scotland and reimagine them in a usually dark way. So I have a new collection out of Scottish folklore inspired stories called Dark Crescent, showing up to the camera for those watching online. So this is Dark Crescent. It's out from Luna Press Publishing on June 3rd. And as I said, they're kind of dark tales going throughout the seasons in Scotland of various creatures, omens, superstitions, ghostly tales that have been inspired by various regions across Scotland and stories I've known since I've grown up, some that I've learned through the process of researching for the book. So yeah, I've just always been very drawn to these stories and enjoy exploring that in my writing. I also, in the day job, have worked across like environment, climate change, nature, policy, comms, that kind of thing. So I often want to explore those kind of themes, environment, in most of my work. Otherwise, I write sci-fi and horror novels and things like that in the works. But we're here to talk about folklore, so I'll focus on those things.
Oh, it's all fair game. There's plenty of folklore in both sci-fi and horror when you drill down into it as well, of course.
Very true, yeah.
And you have, it's fair to say, very successfully written in all these genres because you have been shortlisted for various awards in your time and things like this. So a good back catalogue for people to explore. You used the word dark a couple of times whilst discussing Dark Crescent. Maybe the clues in the title, perhaps the clues in the title, which is interesting because Joanne Harris, who has been on the podcast a couple of times with her own writing, described your book as lyrical and evocative. Now, I would agree with Joanne. I would never disagree with Joanne. If she's listening, she would be pleased to know I would never disagree with Joanne. Joanne's lovely. But she is quite right, of course. It is lyrical and it is evocative. And I think that sense of the landscape and the environment really comes through. I found it a very beautiful book to read in that way.
Thank you.
But yes, at the same time, quite a lot of it is quite dark too. I think I
Mhm.
commented on this to you in an email before while we were setting this up, and I think I remember you saying something along the lines of it kind of gets a bit more hopeful towards the end. And it's true.
Yeah.
It's true. Not every story is dark, but there is certainly a dark element in a lot of it. Does that kind of sum up Scottish folklore and Scottish folk tales for you?
Yeah, I think so. I think like from the very start of when I learned about folklore, from when I was little, I guess it was like the fairies and the other world, and I learned a bit about Selkies and Kelpies. Those kind of popped up, and there is always a sense of like wonder to them, but also danger. So like warnings of I think one of my family friends, dad would tell us not to stand in mushroom circles and things like that because the fairies might come and get you. And if you're writing to the fairies, I used to write letters to the fairies. We always had to leave offerings because you didn't want to make the fairies angry. So like there is that sense of like wondrous, the fantastic, but there's also the dark element of like steeped in all of those from even early on when I grew up, and I was kind of fascinated by that. And when I'm reading fantasy, I kind of noticed that as well, as I've grown up. And then when I was researching, I think there's a lot of like really strange creatures and phenomenon and things like that in Scottish folklore, and I find that really interesting. And a lot of that is like manifestations of the dark and dreary weather, the stormy seas that are very like scary and things that you can't explain. Um, the omens are very much steeped in like, I guess, like thinking about where these came from, of the kind of bad things happening because things were dangerous when these stories were first brought to life. So yeah, I'm just really fascinated by that kind of intersection between the dark and the wondrous and how you kind of bring those to life.
I
So
was
yeah,
gonna
as you mentioned, yeah,
Sorry, I was going to ask you about that crossover actually with the environment and climate, which is obviously one of your areas. So,
yeah,
and you
yeah.
bring that up. Do you think that really does have an impact on the general kind of feel of folk tales in Scotland? Scotland is a very wild place, or lots of parts of it are. The climate is obviously very much colder and wetter, being so far north than a lot of Europe and European folklore. So do you think that really kind of ties in with the whole thing and has a bearing on the stories that come out?
Yeah, absolutely. I think particularly I wrote a lot around like nautical and seafaring folklore and horrors. And I think that was a very big cultural thing and still is a big cultural part of Scotland being an island, with not being an island, but the UK being an island and Scotland having lots of different islands and being very long coastline. I think, and there's a lot of dangers of that, and the weather can be pretty harsh. You've got very harsh winters, you've got long, dark winters. I think that very much kind of seeps into the folklore stories we see, and a lot of like the seasonal change folklore as well. You've got, I think I write about like the Knuckleavy and the sea mither, and that kind of is around like Orcadian and islands folklore, and the idea of like some monstrous being bringing in winter because it is so harsh. But then the sea mither are kind of benevolent being bringing in the summer because that's when the bounties kind of come from that, and what you have to do to keep them happy. And the same with the Cailleach and Breda and that kind of Celtic god idea of them kind of bringing in the different seasons. So yeah, I definitely wanted to play with that because I think that was a very strong theme that comes through a lot of those stories.
Do you think there's much in way of like patterns of migration and incursion from Scandinavia and further north definitely
Yeah,
brings elements into Scottish folklore. We see it
absolutely.
certainly in the Selkie and other kind of seaborne legends like that, and there are
Yeah.
definitely influences that come in. Are there others that kind of cross over that you've touched on as well, would you say?
Yeah, I'm trying to think now that I know there's definitely, like Nordic countries and Icelandic folklore kind of comes in or like blends with Scotland. I don't know any particularly like rooted apart from, I guess you get the Irish and English influences as well, the kind of Celtic traditions that come in. There's one that's like the Green Man, for example, kind of permeates across the UK, but in Scotland you've got the oh my goodness, the words just got out of my head, even though that's like the Gilly Do, sorry, which is literally a folklore from right in the woods where I grew up, in the Highlands. So like that green man wandering through the forest, that's seen very much across like the UK in different interpretations. I think one of the things I found interesting reading around like world folklore as well is those sort of stories do cross over those themes with other traditions. And one of my friends, another author, is writing a kind of book inspired by Filipino folklore. And we were talking, I was reading their collection and vice versa. And there's very crossover in terms of like the themes of shape shifting in the sea, seasonal change, that kind of thing, very much comes across in a very similar kind of origin myths, I guess. So it's not like unique to Scotland that there's that kind of danger of the sea or worries about the seasons changing. I'm sure there are other examples where there's similarities, but that was one I noticed recently.
We haven't covered Filipino folklore in much detail yet either. Do put them in touch.
Yeah, will do. I will do.
Um, there are some stories from Scottish folklore that probably are particularly well known. The Selkie is an obvious example.
Mm-hmm.
Kelpies as well are probably fairly well known.
Yeah.
You talk about what we might call will-o'-the-wisps, or other people
Mm-hmm.
might know them as, under similar names, but like
Yeah, yeah.
floating lights, things like that. So these are found in very many places, but then there are a lot of more specific folk tales, folk creatures, however you want to look at it,
Yeah.
in Scotland. And I want to touch on a few of those perhaps a little bit more, but, because we've covered some of the more well-known ones before.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so you mentioned the Nuckalevy as part of that just
Yeah.
now. Funnily enough, that came up in my life the other day because Alexandra Daw, who's a good friend and a fellow folklore enthusiast and author, asked me who would win in a fight between a Nuckalevy and a black dog. Of course, the black
Both
dog would, as far as
harbingers of doom,
yes,
yeah.
as far as I'm concerned, obviously the black dog would win because how can I not support the subject of my first book? She
Yeah.
was unconvinced by this. I'm going to ask you the same question. Maybe you can settle it for us. Who'd win?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, honestly, the Nuckalabia is like one of my favorites, just in how weird the manifestation of the Nuckalabia is. So for those who don't know, it's like a skinless man torso, not sitting atop a horse, but blended with the horse. So this kind of almost like eldritch horror, with long arms that scrape to the ground, a single, I think, well, in some interpretations, like a single red eye, and when the Nuckalabby comes on land, brings about like a plague and death and omens, and it's part of that kind of winter seasonality. And if you run into the Nuckalabby, you either have to like escape by running to like fresh water because the Nuckalabby comes from the sea. So there's various different stories about the Nuckalabby, and I found that very fascinating, but also extremely gruesome. And anytime I've shared about it online or pictures that you've seen artwork, it's kind of the most horrifying thing. I guess the black dog is a bit more like widely known in the sense of that you immediately see. Is it so? I'm not as I know there's like the Cooshie in Scottish folklore as well, which is similar to the black dog. That kind of three barks spells doom, and then the black dog
Yes.
has this like you see the black dog and you're gonna die imminently or something like that, depending. So yeah, I don't know. I guess if the Nuckalabby saw the black dog first, that would be that's a strange one to think in a direct fight. I would go for the Nuckalabby just because of
Oh,
how gruesome and horse they are.
that's
But
two against one.
maybe
There's a
yeah,
short
there you
story in
go.
this somewhere. There's definitely a short
Where they
story
meet,
in this somewhere.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. One of you, either you or Alexandra, should write that. That would be interesting.
There you go.
Okay, what else sprang to mind that I found particularly interesting? Oh, so you have a very kind of gloomy tale, I guess, that surrounds the Frittening, and I'm not sure that very many people would know much about the
Yeah.
Frittening. So explain a little bit about that.
Yes, this is also, I think, one of my favorite folklore stories in that it's kind of a folk tale, and I did some research into where it might have come from. So, the Frittening, or the boneless or the spineless is like different interpretations of it. Um, in Shetland Islands, that's where it kind of comes from. And the story goes that a gelatinous blob or some blob of some variety, which kind of harkens back to like a lot of sci-fi stories, almost like alien blob washing up to sea. And according to like the folk tales, if a villager or islander would look at the blob for too long, it would drive them to madness. And during the time of the blob being there, the Frittening being on the island, it would throw itself against windows, cause mischief, try to get the attention of islanders and drive them to madness. So I think yeah, obviously, I mean, you can think of different reasons of why this might have come up. You know, I was up in Aberdeenshire where my parents now live. And I think last year there was this huge storm where the sea foam kind of came in. You might have seen pictures online of like sea foam that went up to 5 feet or something, like
Yeah.
drowning towns by the coast. So that kind of, you can imagine how looking into that, you know, shapeless blob moving around, it did look almost like alive in itself. So you can imagine something like that, or jellyfish washing up to shore, or things like that. I just found that quite a fascinating tale, and it kind of feels like it crosses that genre of sci-fi horror, and we've seen it in other pop culture references of these kind of weird blobs that show up. So yeah, that was something I wanted to write about. So it did actually appear in two of the stories in the collections. The one that's titled The Frittening, I think, is the second story in the autumn section of the book. I should mention the book is kind of written across seasons, so starting with autumn where it gets darker to winter, and then gradually a bit more hopeful towards the summer. So yeah, the Frittening appears in that autumn section, and then in a later one where there's like a dystopian story where the rain is causing people to turn translucent and becoming at one with the sea. So that idea of like being driven to madness, but actually becoming at one with the sea, that shapeless blob kind of comes into it as well. So, but the second one's more true to the folklore of it, but I took kind of that inspiration across that.
Yeah, that was something I was going to ask you. How much of what you write in these stories is based on we can't call these things like true folklore or actual folklore because folklore shifts and varies all the time. Narratives
Yeah, yeah,
change all the time.
absolutely.
That's the nature of the subject. It's very fluid. You know, and therefore any kind of changes to the narrative will become embedded and then things will get shaped later on. In fact, your book is probably doing that very thing to a certain extent. You know, some of your ideas can get placed into the narrative and shape it for the future. That's the joy
Yeah.
of it. How much is based on what people would generally know to be representative of the stories that you're using as inspiration, and how much you working around that subject?
Yeah, I think I've been careful to kind of not say that they're retellings
Mm.
in as much as, you know, I've read a lot of compilate like amazing compilations of folklore from that are very much true to the story and the origins, where they're rewriting them in a certain way. You know, you've got like Johnny Mains who collects a lot of those kind of Celtic weird stuff, and Dee Dee Cheney and Willow Wincham who do those kind of folklore of the seas and start like those kind of landscape ones. And I love reading them and getting inspiration, but I didn't want to sell this book as being like a collection of like true to folklore. Not because I don't love those ones, but this was kind of looking at how I wanted to reimagine those stories in a different way, sometimes with a kind of horror bent or even a more dystopian or futuristic across kind of all the genres that I love. And some of the stories will have kind of recognizable, I guess, motifs or tropes that have come up in the more common retellings. So I think, like with the Selkie story, although it's a bit of a spoiler to say it's a Selkie story, so I won't say which one is the Selkie story, but there's very much the idea of the sealskin in the chest and things like that. So I do kind of look at that one. As I said, with the Frittening, I've said it as a kind of second world fantasy island about kind of an omen chaser. There's contemporary ones about the will o' the wisp kind of haunting a graveyard. So very much I've taken the elements of those kind of stories and tried to place them in a different setting than you might usually find them across the book. I think maybe the slight changed the slight difference to that would be the kind of novella at the end, Daughter of Fire and Water. So that's very much inspired around the Cailleach and Breda, and taking one of the interpretations of their story. There's quite a few different interpretations of the relationship between Cailleach and Breda, whether they're the same person, whether they're, just shift at winter and spring, or whether there's two of them. And the inspiration I took from that, so Donald Alexander Mackenzie, who's it's like 16th or 17th century folklorist, had written a story about the Cailleach and Breda, and in that Cailleach had like captured Breda in a mountain cave, and she could only leave at certain times. That's what sparked that inspiration for the novella Daughter of Fire and Water. And I've taken quite a lot of liberty with it, but I very much stuck quite true to that seasonal change and, the Cailleach's appearance and powers and her like seer ability that you kind of see across different interpretations. So yeah, I try to remain faithful to at least the elements of it, but I definitely took liberties with like reimagining certain elements of whether like flipping them on their head of like, is the monster that has been shown as a monster, is it truly monstrous, or how does that monstrousness come out, basically?
How did folklore influence you growing up? How did you get interested in this subject? Because science fiction, horror, it's kind of natural progression of interests for a lot of people. You get it from reading, you get it from watching TV, you get it from going to the cinema, or all sorts of things like that. Folklore and folk tales, less so, which is, I suspect, probably curious in itself when you actually stop and think about it for a moment, because we all have those influences in our lives every single day. We all kind of interact with folklore. I've said this many times. Every day we just don't realize that we're doing it in many cases.
Yeah,
it's kind of inbuilt into our lives, I guess. How did it influence you growing up? How did you become interested in these stories?
Yeah, it's interesting because sometimes it's hard to like pinpoint the exact moment where you kind of find that interest. I think I was speaking to my mom about this the other day. So I was obsessed with fairies growing up. Of all, like when I was very little, I really loved fairies, and my gran actually at the time also loved fairies, so she would gift me a lot of fairy themed things. And we went to like the center. We went up to the Highlands quite a lot. This was before we moved up there. So we moved up to the Highlands when I was 10, but in between kind of visiting up there, we would stop at the centre, which was a centre for fairies. I don't think it's there anymore. And we went there, we went through this tour, and a woman would talk us through the fairies in the other world and changelings and things like that, all that kind of stuff. And I found that fascinating. And then I moved up to Gairloch in the Highlands, which is about an hour and a half north of Inverness, if you've not familiar with that, on the west coast. In a house near Birchwoods, which is where the Gilly Doo story myth like originates. So I heard about that when I was there. And obviously Selkies, I think, I can't quite remember exactly where we heard of them, but there was a pair of seals on the harbour near Gairloch called Sammy and Sally. And I remember one of the like tour guides out on the marine boats talking about how people had a theory that they were Selkies or something like that. So that kind of myth came from just hearing everyday tales, and obviously ghost stories and things like that. I was always quite fascinated. If not, I was a little bit scared of that kind of thing when I was little. I had a very overactive imagination. So I was always thinking about that kind of other world side of things. I read a lot of fantasy, like a lot of growing up. I would be reading kind of like the Redwall series, there's a series called like Into the Deep Woods, which I was obsessed with. The name of the author has gone straight out my head. And like Lord of the Rings and everything like that. I was very much into that. I think because my brother was, has my sound gone? No. Okay. My brother was very much obsessed with that stuff as well. So, and he read a lot of sci-fi, which got me into that. But yeah, I think it just kind of tracks back to different stories throughout growing up. And then I really got into it. I think I started reading more about kind of folklore in maybe 2018, 2019, as I was writing a novel that was inspired by Cailleach and Breda, a novel that hasn't quite made it out there, but I got that I was working on that through the Scottish Book Trust New Writers Award, and working with an author to kind of work through that. She was mentoring me, Julie Britannia, who's the author of the excellent Exodus series. And through that, she kind of prompted me to explore the background of some of the characters in that book. And that led me to kind of explore the Cailleach and Breda story in more detail. And that led to the audio drama, which actually Daughter in Fire and Water was originally a shorter audio drama, which was put out by Alternative Stories and Fake Realities podcast, who also do a lot of stuff on folklore. So I think that's where I really got into it, and from a literary sense, like exploring those stories in about 2019. And then when COVID happened, I think I just got really obsessed, fixated on folklore, and read everything I could about it. I discovered Folklore Thursday, discovered your podcast, and things like that, and just I became very much that was a focus I was really interested in. So I started writing those kind of reimaginings and enjoying writing them, and people seemed to publish them. So that was something, and it was also really nice to, I guess, feeling that sense of isolation during COVID, but also kind of engaging with the landscape and the environment and Scotland through that lens of folklore was quite freeing and cathartic as well, I guess, exploring those kind of stories. Maybe that's why they're all so dark as well, because there's a lot of like isolation themes in there. A lot of going into the sea and just being at one with the sea. Kind of, maybe that's what I was feeling during COVID.
Yeah, baby, the sea is definitely a theme,
The sea.
isn't it?
Yeah.
Neela Dale Bond, Into the Deep Woods. Is that the author that you're
Yes,
searching for?
I think so. Yeah. So there was like a series of those, and there was a bunch of like fairy, folklore, other fantasy element inspired creatures from, I think, probably like across European folklore. And that's one that kind of stuck with me, that series I really enjoyed. And they were really dark as well. I remember being a bit scared by them as a, I guess, 10-year-old or something when I was reading them. So yeah, maybe that's where the kind of dark elements come from too.
Tell us a little bit more about some of the other more obscure creatures and folk tales that you drew on. We've mentioned a couple.
Yeah.
We mentioned the Frittening and we mentioned the Nuckelavee. What else stands out for you as being ones that you particularly enjoyed reworking?
Yeah, so one of the ones was the Marill from, again, Shetland folklore. So the Marill's like a strange anglerfish-like creature that's said to be bigger than a real-life anglerfish, but like a huge kind of sea monster that would kind of sink ships and then live in this kind of mariel, the sea foam, and glow phosphorescent and sing with joy when a ship capsizes. So I found that quite a fascinating story. And I guess that idea of like seafaring groups going out to sea, and of course they're going to meet a monster, and where did that come from? That kind of monstrous idea of the strange anglerfish popping up from sea. So I did write a story, and it's the title to gut a fish first gather its bones, and it's one of my kind of favorite stories to write. I decided to kind of set it. It's about a grandmother who's lost her family to this Mariel, the sea creature, and wants to get revenge, but because she's an old woman who's been gathering bones on the shore, which is that the bones washed up by the Mariel's discards, and people just think she's mad and won't listen to her ideas, even though she's quite sensible, but they just ignore her. And then she sets out on her own on a kind of mission to try and defeat the Mariel. I'll not spoil it. So there's the Mariel there. One of the other ones, which I guess isn't that uncommon, but just in the interpretation of the vampire mythology, so the Bavanshi, or Bavanshi, I guess you might see the kind of interpretation of the banshee there that kind of comes together. So that's a kind of, I think, original folklore from around Glasgow, or there's like a kind of almost like city idea of this vampire like creature, this woman. She is seen as this like beautiful woman who, if you encounter her in the forest, will force men to dance for her until they collapse from exhaustion. And sometimes there's ideas that she has like cloven hooves underneath her dress, and that's how you see it's like a mark of the devil, that kind of thing. So I really enjoyed that one as well. Another one that, again, like vampires and then mermaids. So there's like a Scottish mermaid version, the Cask, who is like a woman who is specifically half salmon, half woman. She is kind of like a mermaid, and seafarers would try to capture her and capture her golden egg. And if they managed to get the golden egg, she would have to grant them wishes. But often she would seek revenge by like going after her captors, and she would swallow them and trap them in her stomach. And to free those people, their family would have to present the golden egg back to her or something else. There's different interpretations of that particular mythology. So I wanted to write a story. The one I wrote was about a fisherman who captures the cask, and it's kind of like a poison chalice because he wants his wish, but he decides that she's so beautiful he doesn't want to let her go either. So that idea, and I'll not spoil the ending, but I did want to very much get that kind of specific folklore into it as well. Trying to think of anything else. There's a lot of like omens in folklore as well, and like harbingers of dooms. So the Slua or the Sluaside, or like the fairy hosts of the dead, they would like appear as omens, and if you see them, kind of like I guess the black dog mythology, you see them, then that's your kind of countdown to death. Similar with, I guess, magpies, you salute a magpie because you want to scare away the omen. Like there's different omens that come throughout the folklore of it. Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's other ones, but that those are a few anyway that are a bit more unusual.
Yes, and it is a lovely collection in that respect as well, because there's a lot in there that people won't be so familiar with. So there's certainly,
Yeah,
although these are reinterpretations, retellings, this is a short story fiction collection, well, with a novella bolted on the end,
yeah.
but there's still a lot to learn, I think, from this as well.
Yeah, and I have at the end, for those who want to kind of know the true interpretations of the folklore, included a small excerpt about each of the stories and where the inspiration came from. There are like 3 stories in there that don't have a specific folkloric inspiration from a creature or omen, but kind of have those elements of folklore in them, kind of imagined new folklore, I guess. And I wanted to include them just because they had that feel of landscape inspiration more than anything. And some of them have elements of, like, I think the Will o' the Wisp appears in one of them, but isn't the main central kind of part of it. But yeah, I talk about that at the end of the collection as well, just if people want to know more about what inspired them and the true folklore of it, I suppose, or what is true folklore. But yeah, a bit more about that.
I guess one element which doesn't come up so much in this collection, although to be fair, it is in there, and it's in there once or twice in perhaps slightly different ways, is witchcraft
Mm-hmm.
and the image of the witch in Scottish folklore. Of course, there is very strong presence in Scottish folklore for witchcraft, and we've seen a lot of good work recently and a lot of publication
Yeah.
recently as well now on the reclaiming of this image and kind of undoing past wrongs in that sense or whatever, which is really fantastic to see. You don't cover that element of folklore perhaps in too much detail. Was that intentional, or is that just the way that this panned out?
Yeah, now you mention it, I mean, I don't think it was intentional to leave it out. And I have read loads of um both fantasy and more like historical fiction interpretations of like the of witchcraft and Scottish witch trials and things like that. And that's been very interesting to me. I guess the themes that come out are that those kind of women not being trusted, and the idea of the vengeful woman and the woman with too many powers. And a lot of that does come out through the creatures in folklore. So a lot of the kind of explanations of the monstrousness of like both monstrous and beauty. So like the Babanshee, for example, beautiful but monstrous, the Kiask, beautiful, that kind of idea does come out in some of the folk tales, but it wasn't intentional. There was actually a story that didn't make it into the collection, which was a witchcraft story. It just didn't quite fit thematically. So that's maybe why. I mean, the closest one, I guess, is in the Frittening. She's a herbalist, kind of, and she's not trusted on the island either, even though they need her to kind of cleanse the omens. They don't want to be around her because they're worried she'll like infect them with her like omens or whatever. but she does it because she wants to help people. So I guess there's a little bit of that kind of the distrust of the that kind of herbalism or other practices, divination, that sort of thing.
Yes, I mean that's the
But
one that I
yeah,
would have drawn on. I think the Frittening is the one that probably has the most of that kind
mhm.
of element to it. But again, there's that interesting interplay in that story where it kind of works both ways because people are
Yeah,
afraid of her and afraid of her views and are not sure about her views. But at the same time, the protagonist of that story who needs her help, she's questioning, how much
as
of what
yeah,
he's saying
exactly.
is correct either. So there's an interesting kind of interplay of characteristics, I think, in that.
Yeah. But yeah, no, the absence wasn't, I don't think, intentional. I guess it's something that didn't quite come out. I think initially because when I started writing the collection, I was drawn to the creatures. But specifically, that was my kind of fascination with the folklore at the start. Was the kind of shape shifting creatures, the nature of that. I guess, yeah, that was that kind of horror elements of it, and I didn't necessarily want it to reflect any specific historical period in time either. A lot of them are um, very loose, either like medieval kind of settings or second world fantasy, and some of them kind of more futuristic or contemporary. So yeah, it wasn't intentional, but maybe something. I do love reading those books though. I think one of the ones I've enjoyed. I think you interviewed the author on the podcast, Cunning Women, recently. Was it Elizabeth
Yeah.
Lee?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, I read that around about the time of my folklore obsession too. So those kind of things I've always enjoyed.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you say about it being thematically not fitting, and I think there is a sense in this collection that it is very much about the landscape and the sea and the environment and all of those things. So I can understand that certainly, and also I think you're right that I don't think you consider what time period any of these stories are set in, which makes perfect sense because folk tales kind of sit outside of time in many respects anyway, or they get
Yeah.
reinterpreted for time periods.
Yeah, I think that was kind of intentional as well. And occasionally I thought about whether I ought to, like, initially, one of the stories, for example, The Women of Ravens, that does actually have the hints at the witch trials. And it was initially a bit more historical. Now that you mention it, that's prompted that idea. But obviously, The Women of Ravens is based around the Kaliach, and it's about a girl who has been kind of traumatized from her village being raided by people who think there are witches there. And she meets this woman of ravens, not ravings, on this moor and asks for help, and then becomes this kind of, I guess, tale of both like dealing with grief and vengeance, or getting back to what happened. So yeah, I ended up taking some of the historical elements out of it because I, from when I was editing it, did want it to kind of have that otherworldly feel, but also more fantasy-esque feel to it. There are a couple that were set in more, like there's one set in Edinburgh, the Bavanchi story. Again, you wouldn't necessarily say what period of Edinburgh, there's no technology or anything like that, but it could be set today. You could kind of theoretically have that there's like a sound recording studio in that one. It's kind of more, you wouldn't necessarily think it fits when I say that description out loud. But there, yeah, I did have a couple that were a bit more rooted in specific times and places as well. And I think as the other thing I wanted to capture with a lot of the folklore, so I grew up in the Highlands, and there's like obviously different landscapes across Highlands and islands, and that kind of island culture very much wanted that kind of to come across too, and that isolation of being on an island or being in a small close knit community, that kind of thing.
Isolation's a very important theme in a lot of these stories, of course, as well. So
Yeah,
really, that again, it all comes back, all circles back to the landscape and the environment there, and the sense of
yeah,
place within that, I think, doesn't it?
yeah, yeah.
What do you think is the state of Scottish folklore now in the 21st century. Is there still a big interest in folklore in Scotland? Do people get that sense of identity from it, the same as perhaps folklore and the social history in Wales is very much a sense of personal identity and identity
Hmm.
of that area. Is that the same in Scotland?
Yeah, good question. I guess in the circles I'm in, the people I know, like there is that interest in the kind of folklore fantastical. I'd say, a lot of this isn't like widespread knowledge, certainly the kind of more obscure folklore side of things, but I think there are certainly certain motifs or imagery that becomes part of that kind of Scottish culture. Like you've got the Kelpie statues in Stirling that everyone drives past, near just outside Stirling, that everyone drives past. But do people know the history of the Kelpies as much? I'm not sure. I guess in like the Highlands is the sort of Gaelic culture up there, and the language is very much imbued with that sort of folkloric tradition as well. So there's probably like definitely strong communities around folklore, and there's also a lot of like strong folk music tradition too. So and that those stories also being retold in that folk music side of things. I think I was interesting when I was thinking about this on one of your last questions. Um, when I was in school, we learned about Greek and Roman mythology, and I was obsessed with that too. Like that is also part of the reason I was obsessed with mythology and things like that. And I did a classics course in like 1 year of classics at uni where I learned about more about Greek and Roman mythology, and I found it very fascinating. But I can't remember a time where we did learn beyond. I think maybe the Selkie's wife tale was something that I read about when I was a teenager or something, and there's a couple of other ones, but and we learned about Scottish history to an extent, but it was all about William Wallace and kind of the battles and Battle of Culloden and history, that kind of thing, and castles. But there wasn't really looking at that in school, but we did learn the myths of Greek and Roman mythology. So I think there's something interesting in that. And I'm not sure what it's like in schools now, whether that's still the same case. Obviously, that was a very long time ago. Um, but yeah, that said, when I go into a bookshop, I see like there's often Scottish mythology or Scottish history sections that are full of whether it's like magic or the occult. I think that's had a bit of a reawakening across the UK of like people being interested in the occult and rituals and divinations and ideas like that. But there's loads of Scottish folktale books out there. So people who are interested in it, there is stuff there. That was a very long-winded answer, but I think it's hard to pinpoint. But I think probably it's not as ingrained in the culture as maybe it could have been. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I think there is this sense, I guess, within the school curriculum still that it's important to learn about the mythology of some other people's cultures for some reason, but somehow it doesn't seem to be as important to learn quite so much about our own cultural history. It is all about the battles, and it's all about the kind of those big elements, and I know there's only a certain amount that you can cover in any
Mm,
curriculum subject. But yeah, it's interesting that we often lose sight of our own mythologies in that way when we look
yeah.
at other people's. I don't know that there's a hard and fast answer to that or reason for it necessarily, but I think it's interesting to speculate on, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
So, Dark Crescent is published on June the 3rd by Luna Press
Yeah.
Publishing, which is an independent press in Scotland. So, a
Hmm.
Scottish publisher producing a Scottish author's work of Scottish folk tales, just how it should be. I will put useful links on the episode page for this episode of the podcast to your website, Lyndsey, so that people can go and find out more
Great.
about you, and to Luna Press so that people can go and pre-order or order, depending on when this episode drops, the book. Probably by the time this comes out, it will just about have published, and it will be a really good time for
Right.
people to go and get it. In the meantime, though, what are you doing next that we should know about?
Yeah, so do have another book with Luna out next year. It's a gothic horror novella with some inspiration from Scottish folklore, but more actually more Scottish occult folk tradition. So it is about a woman who is trapped in the city of Edinburgh, although I don't name it as Edinburgh, but it is Edinburgh, and it's been cursed by eternal rain, which might not sound that unusual right now, but it is a city of eternal rain, and ghosts appear in the rain, and she is the only one who can see these ghosts. So she's kind of haunted in the city, going about her day-to-day life, and she meets someone who can also see the ghosts, and that leads her down to visit this kind of weird house in the center of the city where it doesn't rain, and she has some family history, harks back to that strange house where there's a family that are there. And yeah, I'll not spoil it. That's my next book that comes out. It's out in, I think, around February 2026, again with Luna Press as part of their novella series. Otherwise, I have been working on sci-fi novels, sci-fi horror novels, but mostly inspired by the environment stuff, not as much folklore, I'm afraid. And hoping that'll progress at some point. Publishing can be challenging. But yeah, hoping that'll be the next thing as well. But I'll keep writing short stories as well. I haven't written as many in the last few months because I've been heavy editing on various longer projects, but I'm looking forward to getting back to hopefully some short fiction in the summer as well.
Fantastic. People can find out more news about that as it happens via your website, of course, as well. Where would people, where would you like people to follow you on social media for the best engagement?
Yeah, I'm mostly active at the moment on Blue Sky and Instagram, and I'm just Lyndsey Croal, my full name, on both of those places. So yeah,
I will point people in your direction for those as well. In the meantime, Lyndsey, thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk about the folklore and folk tales of your homeland and your writing and reimagining of them. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me. It's been great.
You can find out more about Lyndsey and her work on her website, and of course you can buy a copy of Dark Crescent wherever books are sold. The fastest and easiest way for you to discover all of this information, of course, is to go over to the Folklore Podcast website, hit the episode page for this episode, and you'll find Lyndsey's biog and all of the links you need in one handy package there on that page for you. I'll be back soon with another episode of the podcast. In the meantime, if you haven't already heard it, don't forget that the new 6-part mini-series produced in conjunction with the 7-County Witch Hunt Project has just started. The first episode came out last week. If you haven't caught that yet, you'll find it slightly lower down on the Folklore Podcast feed. Do go and have a listen. That was a fascinating first interview. There are 5 more episodes looking at the witch hunts across the 7 counties of England, Matthew Hopkins and John Stern, and all of those associated histories coming up in the next few weeks. Followers to my social media will know that I went to London recently and hosted the final Law of the Land panel for the British Academy. This particular panel was looking at folklore associated with wetlands, woodlands, and the weather. That recording has been made available on YouTube now by the British Academy, but we've also recorded it in audio for the Folklore Podcast, and I'll be releasing that episode very soon in conjunction with the British Academy. So watch out for that one too if you need to catch up with that. And don't forget, if you want to support all of the work that the Folklore Podcast is doing to try and bring folklore content to your ears, then do please head over to our Patreon page at patreon.com/thefolklorepodcast, where you can sign up for a small monthly donation and receive even more audio content. Tiers on there start at just £1 a month, which is a very, very small amount of money for a very, very well appreciated piece of support. Of course, don't forget you can join as a free member as well and listen to other content on there too, or just share the Folklore Podcast with your friends and enemies. Share the episodes out to other people, bring in new audiences, and help us to keep doing what we're doing. Thanks very much for listening, and I look forward to seeing you all again very soon.